John Carter, a veteran searching for peace, but his loyal dog sniffed out danger. Ranger's strange behavior led him to a forgotten mine on the mountainside, a place rumored to be cursed. John thought he would find a trapped animal, but what he discovered in the darkness was not an animal, but a secret that could cost him everything he had. This discovery will force him to confront powerful forces he never knew were hiding right inside this quiet valley. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence of the Colorado Rockies was a language John Carter had learned to speak. It was a silence filled with the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines, the distant cry of a hawk, and the soft crunch of pine needles under his worn work boots. After his time in the military, a long tour that ended in 2016, the quiet was a medicine no doctor could prescribe. It settled the noise in his head, the echoes of places far from these mountains. His log cabin, small and weathered by years of harsh winters, stood in a clearing overlooking a vast blue-green valley. It was a fortress of solitude. John was a man built for such places. At 42, he was tall and lean, his body carrying the wiry strength of someone who worked with his hands. His short brown hair was streaked with silver at the temples, a map of years he rarely spoke of. His face was rugged, carved by sun and worry, but his blue eyes held a deep, quiet kindness, usually reserved for his only companion. That companion now lay at his feet, before the cold stone hearth. Ranger was an 8-year-old German shepherd, a magnificent animal with a thick sable coat of gray and silver that faded to white on his chest and paws. He was more than a dog. He was an anchor, a living, breathing piece of peace in John's carefully constructed world. Ranger's temperament was as steady as the mountains themselves, a calm and intelligent presence that moved with the quiet dignity of a creature who knows its purpose. His purpose was John. The morning routine was their unspoken ritual. John would rise before the sun, start a fire, and put the coffee on a battered percolator. Ranger would stretch, his claws making a soft scratching sound on the wooden floorboards, and rest his heavy head on John's knee for his morning greeting. But this morning was different. John was halfway through his first cup of coffee, the bitter steam warming his face, when he noticed it. Ranger was not at his usual spot by the fire. He was standing at the cabin's single large window, perfectly still, his ears pricked forward. A low whine, a sound so unusual for the stoic dog, rumbled deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" John asked, his voice a low rasp. Ranger didn't turn. His gaze was fixed on something far up the mountainside, toward the jagged scar of the old North Star mine, a place that had been abandoned for decades. John followed his line of sight but saw nothing, only the dense forest and the gray rock of the canyon wall. Ranger whined again, louder this time, then turned to look at John, his intelligent brown eyes filled with an urgent plea. He took a few steps toward the door and back again, his movements sharp and insistent. This was not the behavior of a dog who had spotted a deer or a coyote. John had seen that before. This was different. This was an alarm. A profound sense of unease began to creep into the quiet morning. In his former life in an Army reconnaissance unit, he had learned to trust the instincts of a well-trained animal. Ranger's instincts had never been wrong. All right, I'm coming," John said, setting his mug down. He pulled on his worn brown leather jacket over his flannel shirt. The familiar weight is a small comfort. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from a hook by the door and clipped a canteen of water to his belt. He didn't know what they would find, but the mountains demanded respect and preparation. Ranger was already at the door, his tail held low and stiff, a sign of serious business. As soon as John opened it, the dog shot out, not with the playful energy of a chase, but with the focused gait of a searcher. He paused every few dozen yards to make sure John was following, his breath misting in the crisp autumn air. They moved up the winding, overgrown trail that led toward the old mine. The path was treacherous, covered in loose rock and fallen branches. John moved with a practiced silence, his eyes scanning the terrain, his mind falling back into old patterns of awareness. He trusted Ranger completely, but something felt wrong. The very silence he cherished now seemed heavy, charged with a tension that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Ranger's pace quickened as they neared the mine. He scrambled up the final incline, a steep slope of shale and rock that cascaded down from the mine's entrance. The place was a ruin. Heavy timbers that once supported the entrance had rotted and collapsed, leaving a dark, triangular opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. A faded wooden sign, riddled with holes, read, "Danger, keep out." Ranger stopped directly in front of the collapsed opening, sniffing at the dark space within. He let out a single sharp bark, then began to whine again, a sound filled with distress. He pawed at the loose dirt, looking back at John with an expression of desperate appeal. "Easy, boy," John said, placing a calming hand on the dog's neck. "What's got you so worked up?" He knelt beside his dog, his own senses on high alert. The air coming from the mine was cold and smelled of damp earth and decay. It was a dead place. He was about to pull Ranger back, to decide this was just a den for some animal, when he heard it. It was faint, almost lost in the sound of the wind, a soft, wavering moan. It was not an animal. It was human. John's blood ran cold. Ranger looked at him, the dog's gaze unwavering, as if to say, "See? I told you." Every instinct screamed at John to stay away, to go back down the mountain and call for help. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a desperate whisper of pain, swallowed by the immense silence of the canyon. He looked at the dark, forbidding hole, then at the unwavering trust in his dog's eyes. He knew he couldn't leave. With a deep breath, John unclipped the flashlight from his belt. He gave Ranger's head a firm, reassuring pat. "Stay here. Watch," he commanded. He knew, without a doubt, that he had to go inside. John commanded Ranger to stay with a quiet authority the dog had always obeyed. But as he squeezed through the narrow opening, he could hear a distressed whine from behind him. The darkness inside the mine was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that his flashlight beam struggled to pierce. The air was frigid and heavy, with the smell of wet rock and something metallic, like old blood. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on loose gravel, every sense heightened by the enclosed space. The moaning sound was closer now. He swept the beam of light across the damp tunnel walls, revealing rotting support timbers and veins of quartz that glittered like frozen tears. Then the light found her. She was slumped at the base of the rock wall, half hidden in the shadows of a collapsed ore cart. Her clothes, practical hiking gear, were torn and caked with mud and dried blood. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Her face was deathly pale, marred by a dark bruise spreading across her cheekbone. John approached with the cautious, measured steps of his old profession, his flashlight held steady. He was no doctor, but he had seen enough injuries to know that hers were severe. He knelt beside her, his own breath steady despite the hammering in his chest. "Ma'am?" he said softly. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. He gently placed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, searching for a pulse. He found one, but it was weak and thready. She was alive, just barely. From the mine entrance, Ranger let out a short, anxious bark. "It's all right, boy. I'm here," John called out, his voice a low reassurance that was as much for himself as for his dog. He gave the woman's shoulder a gentle shake. "You need to wake up. I need to know what happened." Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. Her eyes were a deep, dark brown, and even clouded with pain, they held a spark of fierce intelligence and defiance. She was younger than he first thought, maybe in her early 30s. Her dark hair was matted with dirt, but he could see she was a woman who carried herself with purpose. This was not someone who got lost on a casual hike. She blinked, trying to focus on his face. Her lips parted, and a dry, raspy sound came out. "Who?" "My name is John. My dog. He found you. You're hurt badly." "It is mutton." Recognition, or perhaps memory, flickered in her eyes. The defiance hardened into a raw urgency. "Omnicorp," she gasped, the word catching in her throat. "Ambushed me. On the trail. She took a shallow, painful breath. I fought. Fell down the ridge. They lost me. I crawled in here, to hide. Her voice was barely a whisper, but every word was delivered with the last of her strength. They think I'm dead. They have to. John's mind raced. He had heard the name Omnicorp before. They were a massive mining and energy conglomerate that had been buying up land all over the state, their methods often rumored to be ruthless. The woman's hand, trembling with effort, moved toward an inside pocket of her torn jacket. John helped guide her fingers. She pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of waterproof plastic. It was a memory card. She pushed it into his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a moment. Everything is on here, she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. Proof. You have to. Her voice broke in a cough. I have to what? John prompted gently. She looked past him, toward the sliver of daylight at the mine's entrance, as if she could see the danger waiting out there. Her next words were chillingly clear. Don't trust anyone, especially not Sheriff Thompson. And with that final warning, the light in her eyes went out. Her body went limp, her head lolling to the side as she fell back into unconsciousness. John was left kneeling in the suffocating darkness of the mine, the small memory card feeling impossibly heavy in his palm. He had come to these mountains seeking an escape from conflict, a quiet place to heal a wounded soul. Now, a war had been delivered to his doorstep, wrapped in a piece of plastic and a dying woman's warning. His first instinct was to call the authorities, but her words about Sheriff Thompson stopped him cold. In a small, isolated county like this, the sheriff was the law. If he was compromised, then there was no one to call. He was truly alone in this. He looked at the woman's peaceful, unconscious face. Leaving her here was a death sentence. Taking her with him meant stepping into the line of fire. He thought of the quiet life he had built, the fragile peace he guarded so fiercely. All of it was now at risk. A soft whine from the entrance reminded him he was not entirely alone. Ranger was out there, waiting. The dog had led him here for a reason. He had not found a problem. He had found a responsibility. In that moment, John knew there was no real choice to be made. You don't leave someone behind, not ever. Okay, girl, he whispered, more to himself than to her. Let's get you out of here. It's not at it. He carefully holstered the flashlight, then gently slid his arms beneath her, one under her back and the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a testament to her ordeal. With a grunt, he stood up, her dead weight a difficult burden in the cramped tunnel. He moved carefully, shuffling backward toward the light, his muscles straining. When he finally emerged from the mine's dark mouth, blinking against the bright morning sun, Ranger was right there. The dog approached cautiously, his nose twitching as he took in the scent of the stranger. He sniffed her hanging arm, then looked up at John, his head cocked in a silent question. John gave a slight nod, and that was all Ranger needed. The dog accepted her presence, falling into his familiar position at John's heel. John adjusted his grip, settling the unconscious woman more securely in his arms. The journey back to the cabin would be slow and difficult, but as he started down the treacherous slope, he knew the physical challenge was the least of his worries. He was now the guardian of a woman named Elena Ramirez, and a secret that could get them both killed. The journey back to the cabin was a brutal exercise in controlled endurance. John carried Elena's unconscious form with a grim determination, Ranger scouting the path ahead, his presence a silent, watchful comfort. Once inside, John gently laid her on his own bed, the only truly comfortable place in the small home. His military field medic training, long dormant, resurfaced from a deep well of memory. He worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away the torn fabric of her pant leg to reveal a badly swollen and dislocated knee. He cleaned and dressed the deep gash on her forehead and the numerous cuts on her arms. He splinted her leg using 2 sturdy pieces of kindling and strips of a clean bedsheet. Through it all, she remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Ranger watched every movement from the doorway, his head low, a quiet sentinel. When John was finished, the dog padded into the room and lay on the floor beside the bed, positioning himself between Elena and the door. He was on guard. John took the small waterproof packet containing the memory card and tucked it into a hollowed-out book on his shelf, a copy of an old poetry collection that no one would ever think to open. He had just finished washing the blood from his hands when he heard it, a sound that violated the sanctity of his quiet world, the low rumble of an engine coming up his long, unpaved driveway. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, shot through him. He moved to the window and peered through the edge of the curtain. A familiar white and green county sheriff's truck was pulling to a stop. Ranger was instantly on his feet, a low growl already forming in his throat. "Easy, boy, quiet," John whispered, placing a firm hand on the dog's back. The growl subsided into a tense silence. John took a deep breath, forcing the rigid training of his past to take over, pushing down the surge of fear and anger. He smoothed his shirt, wiped the sweat from his brow, and composed his face into a mask of mild, reclusive annoyance. He had to be the man he was supposed to be, a quiet veteran who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. A heavy knock echoed through the cabin. John opened the door just wide enough to see his visitor. Sheriff Mark Thompson stood on his porch. He was a man in his early 50s, with a stocky, powerful build that filled out his uniform. He had a full head of graying hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a smile that he used often during town meetings and county fairs. It was a politician's smile, wide and practiced, but it never quite warmed the cold, calculating look in his eyes. "John, good morning," the sheriff said, his voice a friendly baritone. "Sorry to bother you way out here." "Sheriff," John replied, his tone flat. He did not invite him in. Ranger stood just behind John's leg, perfectly still, a coiled spring of silent muscle. "Just making the rounds," Thompson continued, his eyes scanning past John, trying to get a look inside the cabin. "We've had some reports of poachers working the ridges up this way. Heard any unusual shots? Seen anyone who doesn't belong?" The cover story was smooth, plausible. It was the perfect excuse. "It's been quiet," John said, shaking his head. "Just me and the dog. We haven't seen a soul." That's good, Thompson said, though his eyes suggested he thought otherwise. "Still, these guys can be bold. Mind if I take a quick look around your property, just to check for tracks?" He made a small motion to step forward. As he did, John's heart rate spiked. He felt a surge of pure, protective instinct, and Ranger felt it too. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards. It was not loud, but it was filled with an unmistakable menace. Thompson froze, his smile tightening as he looked down at the German Shepherd. Ranger had not moved, but his lips were slightly curled back, revealing the tip of a white canine. John placed his hand on Ranger's neck. "Ranger, easy," he commanded softly. The dog's growl subsided, but his body remained rigid, his focus locked on the sheriff. John looked up at Thompson. "He's protective of the property, doesn't like strangers." "I see that," Thompson said, his friendly demeanor slipping for a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed. "You're sure you haven't seen anything out of the ordinary, John? A campfire? A woman, maybe? We got a call about a hiker who might be in distress." The lie was seamless, shifting from poachers to a hiker. He was fishing, casting a wide net to see what he might catch. Each question, each probing glance, sent a fresh wave of tension through John's body, and each time, Ranger sensed it. The dog remained quiet, but his stillness was a threat in itself. "A woman?" "No," John said, forcing himself to hold the sheriff's gaze. "No one's been up here. If I see anyone who needs help, I'll call it in." He sighed. Thompson held his gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills playing out on the porch of the small cabin. The sheriff was searching for any crack in John's composure, any flicker of deception. John gave him nothing but the tired, wary face of a man who just wanted the world to go away. Finally, the sheriff's smile returned, though it was even more forced than before. "All right then. Well, you keep your eyes open. Let us know if anything changes." "Will do, Sheriff," John said. He watched as Thompson walked back to his truck, the man's friendly wave, a hollow gesture. As the sheriff opened his truck door, he glanced back one last time. The smile was gone. In its place was a look of pure, cold suspicion. It was a look that confirmed everything. John closed the door and leaned against the solid wood, his own composure finally breaking. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Ranger immediately pushed his head into John's hand, whining softly, as if to ask if he was okay. John slid down to the floor, wrapping an arm around his loyal friend. The visit, the probing questions, Thompson's cold eyes, and Ranger's unwavering reaction. It was all a terrifying confirmation of Elena's whispered warning. She was right. The law in this valley was not here to protect him. It was here to hunt him. The sound of Sheriff Thompson's truck faded into the vast mountain silence, but the quiet that returned was different. It was no longer a peaceful blanket. It was a thin, fragile sheet of glass, and John could feel the cracks spreading through it. The confrontation had left a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth, the taste of a fight he never wanted. He moved back into the cabin and checked on Elena. She was still deep in unconsciousness, her face pale against his pillow. Ranger had retaken his post by her bed, a furry, breathing statue of loyalty. The sight of the dog's unwavering vigil stirred something in John's chest. Ranger was pure. He saw the world in simple, honest terms. This is home. This is my person. That is a threat. There was no deceit in him. John wished for a moment that his own world could be that simple again. But it wasn't. It was complicated by a wounded journalist in his bed and a corrupt lawman who now saw him as a loose end. The time for waiting was over. He had to know what was on that memory card. He had to understand the shape and size of the monster he was now facing. He walked to the bookshelf, his movements quiet and deliberate. He pulled out the old book of poetry and retrieved the small, sealed packet. His hands were steady, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He sat at his small wooden desk and powered on his laptop, an old, rugged model that had survived more than its share of rough handling. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue light on his grim face. He carefully removed the memory card from its plastic wrapper and slid it into the laptop's port. A new drive appeared on the screen. He clicked it open. The contents were organized with a journalist's meticulous precision, a series of folders with cold, corporate-sounding names. But it was the subfolders that made his blood run cold. He clicked on a folder labeled Geological Surveys H2O Contamination. Inside were dozens of technical documents and color-coded maps of the entire valley. John, who had learned to read topographical maps as easily as a newspaper during his time in the Army, understood them instantly. The maps showed the network of underground aquifers, the lifeblood of the valley's wells and streams. Overlaid on this network were horrifying annotations marking injection sites for chemical waste, an industrial byproduct of one of Omnicorp's mining operations miles away. The poison was being deliberately channeled into the water that fed every farm, every ranch, every home for miles, including his own. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a wave of nausea. He had chosen this land for its purity, for the clean water that flowed from his well, for the untouched nature that was supposed to heal him. It was all a lie. He had been living in, and drinking from, a poisoned well. Shaking with a quiet rage, he clicked on another folder, Internal Memos Project Lowball. It was filled with screenshots of emails between Omnicorp executives. The language was cold, detached, and utterly brutal. They discussed accelerated property devaluation and a phased acquisition strategy. Their plan was monstrously simple. By secretly poisoning the land, they would cause property values to plummet. Then, they would use shell companies to buy up the devalued land for a fraction of its true worth, all under the guise of a benevolent corporation offering a way out to struggling families. He found one map where his own small plot of land was circled in red, marked as a Phase 1 priority target. It was personal. They were coming for his home. The final folder was the one that broke him. It was labeled, "Medical Reports, Pine Creek." Pine Creek was the small, struggling town down in the valley. The folder contained copies of water sample analyses and confidential medical files that Elena must have acquired at great personal risk. The documents showed a terrifying spike in rare cancers, respiratory illnesses, and birth defects over the last 5 years, a timeline that perfectly matched Omnicorp's secret activities. It wasn't just about land, it wasn't just about money, it was about human lives. The people in Pine Creek, his distant neighbors, were being slowly killed, and they didn't even know why. The corporation wasn't just cheating them, it was executing them in slow motion. John pushed his chair back from the desk, a choked sound escaping his throat. He stumbled to the window and looked out at the majestic, sunlit valley. The beauty of it was now a grotesque mask hiding a terminal sickness. He saw the clear, flowing creek at the bottom of the hill and felt a profound sense of violation. He had sought peace in this wilderness, but the wilderness itself had been turned into a weapon against its own people. The weight of the truth was a physical thing, pressing down on his shoulders, stealing the air from his lungs. This was a different kind of war, a silent, cowardly conflict waged with poison instead of bullets, against people who didn't even know they were soldiers. He felt a wet nose press against his clenched fist. He looked down to see Ranger looking up at him, the dog's brown eyes filled with a deep, knowing concern. The dog could feel the waves of despair rolling off him. Ranger whined softly and rested his heavy head on John's knee, a simple, profound gesture of comfort. John sank to his knees and wrapped his arms around the dog's strong neck, burying his face in the thick, warm fur. He stayed there for a long time, the dog's steady presence a solitary anchor in a world that had just been torn apart. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But as he held on to his only friend, another feeling began to rise through the horror. A cold, hard resolve. He was a soldier. He had been trained to fight, to protect, to stand between the innocent and those who would do them harm. He had thought that part of his life was over, but he was wrong. The burden of what he now knew was too heavy to ignore. It was not just a secret. It was a mission, and he would not fail. The sun rose the next morning, but it brought no warmth to the cold dread that had settled in John's soul. He had not slept. Instead, he had kept a silent vigil in the main room of the cabin, his old service rifle cleaned and resting across his lap, while Ranger dozed fitfully at his feet. In the bedroom, Elena's condition remained unchanged. She was a fragile, ticking clock, and John knew time was running out. As the first light washed over the valley, he was on his feet, moving with the restless energy of a caged predator. A lifetime of training had taught him that a static defense was a losing one. He had to know what his enemy was doing. He grabbed a pair of powerful, military-grade binoculars and climbed a rocky outcrop behind his cabin that gave him a clear view of the mountain's base. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. 3 sheriff's department trucks were parked on the dirt road below. Sheriff Thompson was there, directing a group of about 5 deputies. They were fanning out, forming a search line, a systematic grid designed to sweep the entire mountainside. They were moving slowly, methodically, and they were heading directly toward his property. His first instinct was a primal urge to run, to grab Elena and disappear deeper into the wilderness. But he quickly suppressed it. They would expect that. A man on the run is an easy target. He couldn't fight them, not in a direct confrontation. That left only one option, a tactic as old as warfare itself, deception. He had to lead them away. He had to give them a different trail to follow. He moved quickly back to the cabin, his mind a flurry of tactical calculations. He needed bait, something authentic enough to be convincing. His eyes fell on Elena's torn jacket, which he had folded and placed on a chair. It felt like a violation to use it, but he had no choice. With a sharp knife, he carefully cut a small, jagged strip of fabric from the inner lining, a piece that would not be easily missed. He stuffed the fabric into his pocket. He grabbed a canteen and a length of climbing rope from his supply closet. He looked at Ranger, who was watching him with intelligent, questioning eyes. "Watch her," John said, his voice a low command. "You stay and you watch her." The dog seemed to understand, giving a soft whine before padding back to the bedroom doorway to resume his guard duty. John slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the dense cover of the forest. He moved north, parallel to the search party's slow advance, but separated from them by a deep, wooded ridge. His movements were fluid and silent, a ghost in the trees. He knew these woods better than anyone. Every game trail, every stream bed, every rocky shortcut. After nearly an hour of hard hiking, he reached his destination, a narrow, treacherous ravine about 2 miles north of his cabin. It was a place where someone fleeing in a panic might seek shelter or water. He scrambled down the loose rock to the small creek at the bottom. This was where he would set his stage. He didn't just drop the fabric, he created a story. He found a spot where the muddy bank was soft and made it look as though someone had slipped and fallen hard. He used a rock to scuff the side of a large boulder, as if a body had scraped against it. Then, he took the strip of Elena's jacket and carefully snagged it on the thorns of a wild berry bush right beside the creek bed. It was positioned perfectly to look as if it had been ripped from a pocket during the fall. It was a scene of desperate flight. His work done, he climbed out of the ravine and circled back with painstaking slowness, making his way to an elevated position where he could watch the area without being seen. He waited. It wasn't long before he retrieved Ranger, the dog's presence, a silent reassurance. Now came the most critical part of the plan. He led Ranger on a wide, looping path that would eventually cross the top of the ravine. As they neared the spot, John kept his eyes on the approaching search party, now less than half a mile away. He gave Ranger the subtle hand signal they had practiced 100 times, the quiet command for a search. "Find it, boy." Ranger's demeanor changed instantly. He went from loyal companion to professional search dog. His nose dropped to the ground, sniffing the air, casting back and forth. John had handled the fabric scrap, and his own scent was mingled with Elena's. It was enough. Ranger picked up the trail and moved with purpose toward the ravine. Standing at the edge, the dog pointed his nose down toward the berry bush and let out the loud, clear, attention-grabbing bark that was his trained alert signal. He barked again, and then a third time, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. John saw the search party below him come to a halt. Heads turned in his direction. Thompson raised a hand, pointed, and the entire line of deputies changed course, converging on the sound. The trap had been sprung. As they got closer, John gave Ranger a quiet command, and the two of them faded back into the trees, circling to a safe vantage point. Through his binoculars, he watched Thompson and his men descend into the ravine. He saw one of them point to the bush. Thompson himself walked over and carefully plucked the piece of fabric from the thorns. He held it up for the others to see. The diversion was a success. They had taken the bait. But as the other deputies started searching the immediate area, one of them stood apart. He was younger than the others, with a lean build and sharp, intelligent eyes. John didn't know his name, but he could see the man wasn't celebrating the find. Instead, Deputy Evans was studying the scene with a thoughtful, skeptical expression. He looked at the scuff marks, at the position of the bush, at the tracks. He seemed to sense that it was all a little too perfect, a little too clean. John saw him say something to Thompson, gesturing at the scene, but the sheriff shook his head and clapped the deputy on the shoulder, dismissing his concerns. The search party eventually reorganized and headed north, following the false trail. John had bought himself time, but as he and Ranger began their silent retreat back to the cabin, the image of the young deputy's doubting eyes was burned into his mind. He had fooled the sheriff, but he hadn't fooled them all. The noose had been loosened, but it was still there, and now one of them knew to pull on it. The hours following the diversion crawled by with agonizing slowness. John sat in his armchair, facing the window, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt through his system. He was on watch, his entire being thrumming with a tense hypervigilance he had not felt in years. Ranger lay on the floor beside him, a silent partner in his vigil, the dog's ears twitching at every sound, his body a picture of coiled readiness. John had managed to make a simple broth, its savory steam filling the small cabin with a comforting aroma that felt completely at odds with their dangerous situation. He knew Elena would need nourishment if she was ever going to wake up. As if summoned by the thought, a soft groan came from the bedroom. John was on his feet in an instant, Ranger right beside him. He moved to the doorway. Elena's eyes were open. They were no longer clouded with pain, but were sharp and alert, though filled with a deep, disoriented fear. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar log cabin, finally landing on the large, imposing figure of the German shepherd standing at the foot of her bed. She flinched. "Easy," John said, his voice low and calm. "He won't hurt you. You're safe here." Elena shifted her gaze to him, her eyes narrowing as she tried to place his face. "The mine," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "That's right," John confirmed. "My dog, Ranger, found you. I brought you here. You've been unconscious for over a day." He entered the room slowly, showing his empty hands, moving in a way that would not spook a frightened animal or a frightened person. "I'm John. I splinted your leg as best I could. You need water." She watched him with a journalist's cautious, analytical stare as he brought her a glass of water. He helped her sit up, her body wincing in pain. The initial moments were filled with a tense, unspoken negotiation of trust. She was a woman who trusted no one, and he was a man who wanted no one to trust. He told her everything. He recounted Ranger's strange behavior, the discovery in the mine, and her whispered warning. Then he told her about Sheriff Thompson's visit, the flimsy excuse about poachers, and the way Ranger had reacted, growling at the unseen threat. He described the search party and the false trail he had created with the piece of her jacket. As she listened, her expression shifted from suspicion to a weary, grim understanding. He had not only saved her, he had protected her. He had believed her. When he finished, she sagged back against the pillows, a flicker of gratitude in her tired eyes. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying a profound weight. "My name is Elena Ramirez, and you were right to believe me. It is." With the foundation of trust laid, she began to talk. She told him she was an independent journalist, funded by a grant to investigate corporate corruption in rural areas. She had been tracking Omnicorp for nearly a year, starting with an anonymous tip from a guilt-ridden former employee. "It's worse than you can imagine," she said, her voice gaining strength from her conviction. "Thompson is their gatekeeper. He's been on their payroll since 2022. His job is to manage local obstacles. That means burying environmental complaints, intimidating landowners who won't sell, and making sure no one looks too closely at their operations." "How do you know for sure?" John asked. "It's on the card," she replied, nodding toward the bookshelf. "I have copies of bank transfers to an offshore account in his name. I even have a recording of a conversation between him and an Omnicorp executive, a man named Henderson. They discussed my investigation. Henderson called me a loose end that needed to be tied off permanently." The cold corporate euphemism for murder hung in the air between them. Elena had not just stumbled upon a corporate crime, she had become the target of an execution order sanctioned by a corrupt lawman. Later, once Elena had eaten some of the broth, John brought her the laptop. Together, they went through the files, the pale light of the screen illuminating their determined faces. She was the strategist, explaining the context of each document, pointing out the key players and the irrefutable evidence. John was the tactician, analyzing their enemies' likely moves and assessing their own dangerously limited resources. "They won't give up," he said, his eyes fixed on the map of the search grid he had seen. Thompson's deputy, the young one, he was suspicious. "He knew the scene I created was too clean. They'll be back. And it is Alda. We can't go to the state police," Elena reasoned, thinking aloud. "Thompson has friends everywhere. He'll get a call the second we file a report, and he'll know exactly where we are. We would never make it out of the county alive." They both fell silent, the grim reality of their situation settling over them. They were on an island, surrounded by a sea of corruption, with only a dog and a secret for protection. They were completely and utterly on their own. "Our only chance," John said, finally breaking the silence, "is to get this information to someone outside his sphere of influence, someone federal, or someone in the media so big that they can't be silenced." Elena nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I have a contact at a national paper, but reaching him without being traced is the problem." During their intense discussion, Ranger, who had been lying quietly on the floor, seemed to sense a shift in the room. The initial tension between the two humans had dissolved, replaced by the focused energy of a shared purpose. He stood up, stretched, and walked over to the bed. He gently nudged Elena's hand with his wet nose before resting his great head on the edge of her mattress, his brown eyes soft. Elena looked startled for a moment, then a small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. She slowly raised her hand and stroked the dog's head. "He's a good boy," she said softly, looking at John. "He's the best," John agreed. In that small, quiet moment, something profound shifted. The dog's simple act of acceptance had solidified their bond. They were no longer a reclusive veteran and a wounded journalist. They were a team, an unlikely alliance forged in desperation and united by a common deadly enemy. The burden was still heavy, but now it was a burden they would carry together. The alliance had been formed, but a grim reality settled in the small cabin. They were two people, one of them injured, with a dog and a data file, against a corrupt sheriff and a ruthless corporation. They were a tiny lifeboat in a vast hostile ocean. "My contact at the paper, his name is Ben," Elena said, her voice still weak but steady. "He's solid. He would never back down from a story like this." John considered it, turning the idea over in his mind. A journalist was a powerful weapon, but the media could be slow. An investigation would take time they didn't have. Thompson was hunting them now. They needed someone who could move faster, someone who understood the kind of fight they were in. "No," John said finally. "Not yet. We need legal protection first. We need someone who knows their playbook." His mind sorted through a short list of names, men from his past, men he had trusted with his life. Most were gone, scattered to the winds after their service. But one name remained. "There's a guy, someone I served with, David Chen." He pictured David in his mind. He was a wiry, brilliant man who always wore a wry smile, the kind of soldier who could repair a radio with a paperclip and a piece of gum. He was the smartest man John had ever known. After leaving the Army in 2018, David had gone to law school and now ran a successful practice in Denver, specializing in technology and corporate malfeasance. He was the perfect man for the job. He was their only shot. But as soon as the thought solidified, a cold wave of dread washed over John. To call David would be to pull him out of his safe, successful life and drag him into this muddy, bloody fight. David had a wife, 2 young daughters. John had seen pictures of them in Christmas cards. To involve him would be to put all of them in the crosshairs of Omnicorp. "John, are you okay?" Elena asked, noticing the sudden tension in his body. He didn't answer. He stood up and began to pace the length of the small cabin, a caged tiger consumed by a silent, internal war. His footsteps were heavy on the wooden floorboards, each one a drumbeat of his rising panic. He could not do it. He could not put another friend in harm's way. The cabin walls seemed to close in, and the scent of pine and wood smoke was replaced by the smell of hot dust and cordite. The memory rose from the depths of his mind, an unwelcome ghost he had spent years trying to bury. Afghanistan, 2015, a dusty village, a routine reconnaissance mission that went sideways. They were ambushed. He was the team leader. He made a call, a split-second decision to move to a different position, a position he thought offered better cover. It was the wrong call. The image of Private Miller, a fresh-faced kid of 19 from Ohio, flashed in his mind, Miller's cry, as the bullet hit his leg. The sight of his own hands, covered in the kid's blood, as he tried to stop the bleeding. Miller had survived, but he had lost the leg. He had gone home to a life irrevocably altered because of John's mistake. On the day he left the army, John had sworn to himself he would never again be responsible for bringing that kind of pain to someone he cared about. He was breathing heavily now, his hands clenched into tight fists. He was back in that dusty village, the weight of his failure pressing down on him, suffocating him. Fighting alone was one thing. He could accept his own fate. But risking David's life, his family's safety, felt like an unforgivable betrayal. Elena watched him, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. She saw a man not just wrestling with a difficult choice, but battling the ghosts of his past. She remained silent, giving him the space he needed. Then, a solid, warm presence blocked his path. Ranger had gotten up and stood directly in front of him, forcing him to stop his frantic pacing. The dog looked up, his brown eyes filled with an unwavering, gentle intelligence. He let out a soft whine and pushed his head firmly against John's chest, a gesture of profound comfort and grounding. John looked down at his dog. He felt the steady rhythm of Ranger's breathing, the solid weight of him. The simple, honest loyalty in the animal's eyes cut through the noise of the memory. Ranger was not judging him for his past. He was here with him in the present, trusting him, depending on him. The dog's presence was an anchor, pulling him back from the spiraling currents of his trauma. He slowly sank to his knees, wrapping his arms around Ranger's neck. The dog's quiet strength flowed into him. He was not that man in Afghanistan anymore. He could not let the ghosts of past mistakes paralyze him into making a new one. Fighting alone was not strength. It was fear. The truest form of courage was trusting your team. He looked over at Elena, who was watching him with quiet support. He had a new team now, a small, desperate one, but a team nonetheless. He stood up, his resolve hardened into steel. "I'm making the call," he said, his voice clear and steady. He sat at the laptop, his movements now precise and purposeful. He pulled a small, unmarked thumb drive from his desk drawer. It contained an old military-grade encryption software he had kept for years, just in case. He knew David would have the key. He selected 3 of the most damning documents from Elena's memory card, just enough to prove their case was real without risking the entire cache of data. He encrypted the files. Then, he composed a short, carefully worded email. The subject line read, "Land Survey Question." The body of the message was brief. "David, bad reception up here. Need a legal opinion on a land survey document I came across. It's complicated. Call me on the secure line when you can. Watch your 6. J." The phrase, "watch your 6," was a piece of their shared past, a simple warning that meant danger was close. It was a code between brothers in arms. David would understand. With a final, deep breath, he hit send. The email disappeared into the ether, a desperate message in a bottle cast out into a digital ocean. It was more than a call for help. It was a leap of faith, an act of defiance against the ghosts that had held him captive for too long. His war was not over, but for the first time in a long time, he was no longer fighting it alone. The day after the email was sent was the longest of John's life. Every hour stretched into an eternity of tense silence. There was no reply from David. John paced the cabin, checking the perimeter, watching the unchanging tree line until the pines seemed to watch him back. He and Elena spoke in hushed tones, their conversations circling the same grim topics: their dwindling food supplies, the lack of a clear plan, and the ever-present threat of Thompson's return. Elena, though still in considerable pain, had regained some of her strength. She insisted on helping, sorting through John's medical supplies and organizing his pantry. It was a small act of defiance against her own helplessness. During their work, she felt a constant, reassuring presence at her side. Ranger rarely left her, a furry shadow offering quiet companionship. He seemed to understand that she, like his master, carried a heavy burden. The quiet was shattered late the next afternoon. It was the sound they had been dreading, the crunch of tires on gravel, louder and more determined than before. 2 sheriff's trucks were pulling up, their lights not flashing, which was somehow more menacing. "He's back," John said, his voice grim. "Get in the cellar. Now." He rushed to the center of the room and threw back a large bearskin rug, revealing a heavy wooden trapdoor. He lifted it, exposing a dark, narrow space that smelled of earth and preserved vegetables. It was a small root cellar, just big enough for one person to hide in. He helped Elena, her face pale with pain and fear, down the short ladder. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear," he commanded, his eyes locking with hers for a moment of shared understanding. He closed the door, replaced the rug, and slid a heavy wooden armchair partially over it. It was a flimsy deception, but it was all he had. Ranger stood at his side, a low growl already vibrating in his chest. John placed a hand on his back. "Not yet, boy. Wait for my signal." A hard, authoritative knock rattled the cabin door. John opened it to find Sheriff Thompson standing there, his friendly mask completely gone. Behind him stood the young, observant deputy, Evans, and one other officer. Thompson's face was a granite slab of cold fury. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He shoved a piece of paper into John's chest. "Search warrant, Carter." He held up a clear plastic bag containing the shattered, dirt-caked lens of a professional-grade camera. "My men found this near your property line this morning. Belongs to a missing corporate consultant. A judge agreed that gives me probable cause to toss this place from top to bottom. Now, you're going to step aside." John had no choice. He stepped back, keeping Ranger close to his leg, and the 3 officers entered the cabin. The search was not a search, it was an invasion. They moved with a barely controlled violence, pulling books from shelves, emptying drawers onto the floor, and slashing open bags of flour and sugar in the kitchen. Thompson tore John's bedroom apart, ripping sheets from the bed and throwing the mattress to the floor. Through it all, John stood like a statue, his face a blank canvas, betraying nothing of the storm raging inside him. His eyes, however, never stopped moving, tracking each officer, calculating, waiting. The memory card was still in the hollowed-out book on the main shelf. It was exposed. It was vulnerable. While Thompson and the other deputy continued their rampage, Deputy Evans began his own, quieter search in the main room. He was the one John had been worried about. He moved with a methodical patience, tapping walls, checking the floorboards, his sharp eyes missing nothing. His gaze lingered on the bearskin rug and the oddly placed armchair. He walked over and nudged the chair with his boot. He knelt down, his fingers touching the edge of the rug. He was inches from the trapdoor. John's blood turned to ice. There was no time to think. He caught Ranger's eye across the room. He gave the signal, a subtle, almost imperceptible flick of his fingers, a command they had practiced in the field countless times. It was the signal for a chaotic, non-aggressive diversion. Ranger exploded into action. He did not lunge at the deputy. He launched himself sideways, barking with a frantic, sudden ferocity at a tall, rickety shelving unit that stood against the far wall. The shelf was cluttered with a lifetime of backcountry odds and ends. Old tools, glass jars filled with nuts and bolts, spare parts for the generator, and stacks of tin cans. The dog crashed into the wooden supports with his full weight. The effect was instantaneous and deafening. The entire unit swayed and then toppled over with a tremendous crash. Metal tools clanged against the stone hearth. Glass jars shattered, sending their contents scattering across the floorboards. Tin cans rolled in every direction. It was a sudden, violent avalanche of noise and chaos that made all 3 officers spin around in shock. In that single, unified moment of distraction, John moved. His actions were a fluid blur of pure, desperate instinct. He plucked the poetry book from the shelf, his fingers finding the hidden compartment. He slipped the memory card out and, in the same motion, turned and dropped it into the large, open sack of dog food that stood by the fireplace. The small card disappeared instantly into the dark brown kibble. "What the hell?" Thompson roared, turning his fury on the dog. "Get that animal under control, Carter." "Ranger, heel!" John shouted, feigning shock and anger. He grabbed his dog's collar, pulling the still barking animal back. "I am so sorry, Sheriff. He's terrified of strangers. He's never done this before." The spell was broken. Evans stood up, his attention pulled away from the rug. The search continued for another 20 minutes, but their focus was gone, their frustration palpable. They found nothing. The cellar remained secret. The memory card lay buried in a bag of dog food. Thompson finally called it off, his face flushed with rage. He stormed onto the porch and got right in John's face, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "I don't know what you're hiding, Carter, but I will find out. This mountain isn't big enough for you to hide from me." John watched them leave, his hands trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. He closed the door on his trashed, violated home. He led Elena out of the cellar, her face pale but resolute. The silence returned, but it was heavy with the certainty of what was to come. Thompson was no longer just suspicious. He was now a man obsessed. The aftermath of the search was a desolate quiet. John and Elena moved through the wrecked cabin like ghosts, silently righting overturned furniture and sweeping up shattered glass. The physical mess was a reflection of their shattered hope. More than 36 hours had passed since John had sent the email to David. The silence that followed was a heavy, suffocating blanket. John's desperate leap of faith now felt like a foolish misstep. David was not coming. The message had been intercepted, or worse, David had made the sensible choice to not get involved. They were alone. "He'll come," Elena said, her voice a thin thread of optimism in the grim atmosphere. She was sitting at the table, her splinted leg propped up on another chair, trying to sort a pile of scattered books. John didn't answer. He stood at the window, staring out at the unforgiving wilderness, his shoulders slumped with the weight of their failure. Ranger, sensing his master's despair, nudged his hand, but for the first time, the comfort felt distant. He had led them into a dead end. Just as the last sliver of hope was about to fade, he heard it, a different kind of engine noise. It was not the heavy growl of a sheriff's truck, but the smooth, quiet hum of a sedan. It was moving fast up his driveway. John's training took over instantly. "Get down," he said to Elena, his voice sharp. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the side of the door, his heart pounding a frantic, uncertain rhythm. Was it Thompson, trying a new tactic? Or was it Omnicorp's private contractors, the ones who had ambushed Elena? The sleek, dark gray sedan pulled to a stop. Ranger stood beside John, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his body tense. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He was shorter than John, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that seemed absurdly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the Rockies. He moved with a calm, purposeful energy, his sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the cabin, the trees, every possible threat in a single, sweeping glance. John's breath caught in his throat. The suit was new, but the eyes were the same. It was David Chen. John lowered the rifle and opened the door. The two men stood for a moment in silence, years of a shared, unspoken history passing between them. David's usually wry smile was absent, replaced by a look of grim concern. "Jay," David said, his voice calm and steady. "You look like hell." "You're late," John replied, a wave of profound relief washing over him. David's eyes flickered to the massive German shepherd standing guard. Ranger was still tense, his gaze locked on the newcomer. "This is Ranger," John said. "He's a friend." "It's 9. David nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact with the dog. He did not offer a hand to pet him, a gesture he knew a protective animal would see as a threat. Instead, he simply stood his ground, showing no fear. "Looks like a good friend to have." Ranger seemed to consider this, and after a moment the growl subsided. He had accepted the visitor based on his master's lead. David stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the trashed interior and landing on Elena. "You must be the journalist," he said to her. His tone was respectful. "John's message was brief, but I gathered you were in trouble." He placed a slim, high-tech laptop and a satellite phone on the table. "I got your email, Jay," he said, turning back to John. "I decrypted the files on the way here. The land survey is even worse than I imagined." Hope, bright and powerful, surged through the cabin. "Before I started driving, I made 2 encrypted calls," David continued, his voice all business. He was a lawyer now, a different kind of soldier, but the strategist in him was the same. The first was to a contact I trust at the State Attorney General's office. "She's the lead investigator for the Environmental Crimes Unit. She is standing by." The second call was to a reporter at the Washington Herald, a 2-time Pulitzer winner I've worked with before. He is also standing by. Neither of them can be touched by a corrupt county sheriff. John and Elena stared at him, stunned by the speed and precision of his actions. He had not just answered their call for help, he had brought an army with him. The small wooden table, moments ago a symbol of their despair, was transformed into a command center. The 3 of them gathered around it, their faces illuminated by the glow of David's laptop screen. They were no longer hiding. They were planning a counterattack. "Thompson and Omnicorp have been able to operate because they control the flow of information here," David explained, pulling up satellite maps of the area. "We're going to hit them from every direction at once. We'll create a storm they can't possibly control." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and audacity. David would make 2 calls simultaneously from the satellite phone. In the first, he would give the green light to the state investigator, who had a team ready to move. They would secure a state-level warrant to raid Omnicorp's local offices and seize all their records, while another team moved to arrest Sheriff Thompson on charges of conspiracy and corruption. In the second call, he would give the go-ahead to the reporter, who would publish Elena's story, complete with the damning documents, on the newspaper's website. The story would be national news in an instant. "They won't know what hit them," Elena said, a fierce light returning to her eyes. "By the time they realize what's happening, the state will have their files and the whole world will be reading about it." "Exactly," David confirmed. "They won't have time to shred documents, erase hard drives, or intimidate witnesses. We take away their greatest weapon, secrecy." As they finalized the details, John felt a profound shift within himself. He was no longer a man hiding from his past. He was a part of a mission again. He provided tactical advice on Thompson's likely reactions, pointing out escape routes and potential evidence locations. Elena provided the narrative, helping David and the reporter understand which pieces of evidence would have the most powerful public impact. Ranger lay under the table, his head on his paws, a silent, steady presence at the heart of their makeshift command center. His work was done. He had found the wounded stranger and trusted his master to do the right thing. He had stood guard, offered comfort, and created the diversion that had saved them all. Now, he simply rested, a quiet guardian watching over his pack as they prepared to bring the truth into the light. The small cabin was no longer a shelter of fear. It was the front line in a war for justice. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the eastern sky in hues of pale pink and orange. Inside the small cabin, there was no sense of peace, only a silence so thick it felt like a physical pressure. The 3 allies were gathered around the small wooden table, their faces illuminated by the stark light of David's laptop. The satellite phone was in the center. It was time. David looked at John, then at Elena, a silent question in his eyes. They both nodded. With a calm precision that reminded John of a surgeon before a critical operation, David made the 2 calls. His words were brief, measured, and final. He gave the 2 green lights, one to the state investigator and one to the reporter in Washington. He disconnected the phone. "It's done," he said, his voice the only sound in the room. "The dominoes are falling." For a long moment, nobody moved. The message was sent, the signal given. They had fired their only shot. Now, all they could do was wait and see if it hit the target. David navigated to the website of the Washington Herald and began refreshing the page. They watched the screen, their hearts pounding in unison. Then it appeared. The headline was stark, brutal, and impossible to ignore. Poison in the Pines. Omnicorp accused of toxic conspiracy in rural Colorado. Below it was Elena's name and a picture of the valley, beautiful and serene, a chilling contrast to the story's content. The story was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It laid out the entire conspiracy with cold, hard facts, supported by the key documents from the memory card. It told the stories of the families in Pine Creek, of the strange illnesses and the unanswered questions. It was a declaration of war. Almost immediately, the firestorm began. David's phone, now connected to the local network, started buzzing with notifications from news alerts. Within an hour, the story was the top headline on every major news network in the country. Just as David had predicted, it was too big, too public, to be silenced. A coded text message came through on his satellite phone. It was from his contact at the Attorney General's office. It read simply, "Team is a go. Air support on site." John went to the window. In the distance, he could see them. Two black helicopters slicing through the morning sky, heading toward the Omnicorp regional headquarters in the next county. The cavalry had arrived. The days that followed were a blur of shocking, vindicating news. David, now their official legal counsel, relayed the updates as they came in. The first report was the one John had been waiting for. On the afternoon of the first day, a team of state police, backed by FBI agents, had walked into the county sheriff's office. David showed them a photo on his phone, sent from a trusted source. It showed Sheriff Mark Thompson, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, being led away in handcuffs. The shadow that had loomed over them was gone. Next came the news about Omnicorp. Federal agents from the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the FBI raided their offices, seizing servers and boxes of documents. The company's stock plummeted. Several executives, including the man named Henderson, were arrested on federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the Clean Water Act. But the most powerful impact was on the community. News crews descended on Pine Creek, and for the first time, the people of the valley had a voice. They shared their stories of sick children, of failed crops, of a deep, unshakable feeling that something was wrong with their land. Their fear and confusion turned into a righteous anger, an unstoppable force for justice. With David's guidance, they formed a community council and filed a massive class action lawsuit against Omnicorp, demanding not just compensation, but a complete environmental cleanup of the valley they called home. Weeks later, a different kind of quiet had settled over the mountains. The media had moved on to the next crisis, leaving behind the slow, grinding gears of the legal system. Elena, now a nationally recognized journalist, had her leg in a proper cast and was staying in a small rental in Pine Creek to cover the long legal battle ahead. John was no longer a recluse. His role in uncovering the conspiracy had become a local legend. When he drove into town for supplies, people would stop him, not with the wary looks he was used to, but with handshakes and heartfelt words of gratitude. He was still a man of few words, but he accepted their thanks with a quiet dignity. He was a part of their world now, a guardian who had stood up for them when no one else would. One sunny afternoon, he and Ranger were walking down Pine Creek's main street. A little girl, no older than 7, ran up to them, her eyes wide with awe. She gently patted Ranger's head. "Mommy says you're the hero dog," she said. "You're the one who found the secret." John looked at the girl's mother, who was watching with tears in her eyes. "We owe you everything," the woman said. "You and your beautiful dog." In that moment, John felt a sense of peace he had never known before, not even in the deepest silence of his mountain solitude. That evening, he sat on his porch, the cabin behind him, clean and repaired. It was no longer a fortress to hide in, but a home to live in. Elena was there with him, a comfortable silence between them as they watched the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Ranger was lying at his feet, his head resting on his boots, his duty done. John looked down at his loyal friend, the dog whose strange behavior had started it all. Ranger had not just led him to a wounded stranger in a mine. He had led John out of a dark mine of his own, out of the isolation and guilt that had been his prison for years. The dog had given him a new mission, a new purpose. He had not just saved Elena's life, he had saved John's soul. The war was finally over, and in the quiet of the evening, surrounded by friends, John Carter was finally home. This story reminds us that the most profound courage is often found not in the noise of a long-past battle, but in the quiet, unwavering loyalty of a faithful friend. A true companion doesn't just walk beside you, they have the power to lead you back to the very best version of yourself. If the incredible bond between John and Ranger moved you, we hope you'll share that feeling with us in the comments below. Your support, through subscribing and sharing this story, allows us to continue bringing these tales to life. And our next journey is ready to begin right now, in the video that has just appeared on your screen.